Good evening. A month ago, on the second Sunday evening of, what month is it now? It's October now. Is it October now? Yeah. Second Sunday evening of September, I spoke about types, typology. We talked about David before that in Psalm 22. And then on that Sunday evening, we talked about Abraham and Isaac and Joseph and how his brothers sold him into slavery and the typology that was for Christ. I want to talk about Joseph from a different angle this evening. So it's not going to be about types and foreshadowings and that kind of thing. But it is going to be about Joseph. Turn first to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. I want to ask you, have you ever been bitter about somebody? Maybe something, but I think more often we're bitter with people than we are with things and situations. You know, just that kind of unhappiness with someone. Kind of a severe unhappiness, bearing a grudge against that person, this resentment that just kind of smolders in your heart, or even anger. Maybe it was for something that they really did wrong to you. Or maybe it was something that you just perceive as wrong and it wasn't wrong. But either way, we can be bitter about things with someone around us. Bitterness is a bad thing in our hearts. I think we see that in Joseph for a while, for several years, in fact. But in Hebrews chapter 12, we read a little bit about the problem of bitterness. The context of Hebrews chapter 12, as you read the beginning of the chapter, the Hebrews author is writing to his audience about how they've suffered at the hands of others, how others have done them wrong, how others have mistreated them. And they've been suffering in that. And first the Hebrews author in chapter 12 talks to them about how to view that suffering. But then in verse 12, the Hebrews author says this: "Therefore, strengthen the hands that are weak and the knees that are feeble, and make straight paths for your feet, so that the limb which is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed." Then verses 14 and 15. "Pursue peace with all men." Remember, this is the context of people mistreating them and how they might view that. The Hebrews author says, "Pursue peace with all men, and the sanctification without which no one will see the Lord." Verse 15, "See to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled." They've been suffering at the hands of people. They've been mistreated. It's easy to grow resentful in those situations and to treat people with resentment. And the Hebrews author is saying, you get yourself right. You know, if you've got a limb that's out of joint about somebody, get that limb in shape so that you're going to do well regardless of what they do. Make straight paths for your feet. Pursue peace with everybody, because you won't see the Lord without it. And then see to it that no one comes short of the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springing up causes trouble, and by it many be defiled. As I said a moment ago, I think in Joseph we see a case of resentment toward his family, toward his brothers in particular. And I want you to think tonight, if there's any situation in your life about which you are bitter, about which you carry this resentment, and it affects the way you relate to that person or those people or to situations in general. And think about that as we look at the story of Joseph. So let's go back to Genesis. And we're going to spend a fair amount of time this evening just going through the story. Really, most of our time is going to be spent just going through his story and then coming back to this idea of resentment. So chapter 37, verse 2. These are the records of the generation of Jacob. Jacob is the father of those 12 sons. Joseph, when 17 years of age, was pasturing the flock with his brothers while he was still a youth, along with the sons of Bilhah, the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought back a bad report about them to their father. Well, as we read the rest of the story, we find it believable that there might have been a bad report to bring about them. Well, Joseph brings that report back to their father. Verses 3 and 4, now Israel, that's Jacob of course, loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age. I think that might be a little bit like grandfathers and their grandkids. You know, the first kids you experience, your own kids, you know, but you get grandkids, and man, I look at the way my dad relates to his grandsons compared to how he related to us boys. There's a lot more patience with and maybe that's similar to, you know, Joseph is the child that came along much later than some of the others. Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age. And he made him a varicolored tunic. And his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers. There's a lesson there about letting children see that you love one more than the others. But that's not our sermon tonight. And so they hated him and could not speak to him in friendly terms. There's some resentment, but we're not going to be concentrating on that angle of resentment tonight. But they hated Joseph because of this. And then came Joseph's dreams. Dreams that showed that he was going to be in a position over them. He's their kid brother. And he comes along, first of all, they know their father loves him. What's so great about him? And now he comes along, he's got these dreams to tell that show he's going to be in a position of authority. Then Joseph had a dream, verse 5, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. And he said to them, please listen to the dream which I've had, for behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and lo, my sheaf stood up and also stood erect. And behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. You can imagine the older brothers hearing this. And then there's this second dream about the stars and the sun and the moon representing the parents. And then everybody's going to bow down to Joseph's star. Well, his brothers don't like this at all. Verse 11, and his brothers were jealous of him. His father kept the saying in mind. And then Joseph is sent to his brothers. Verse 12, then his brothers went to pasture their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers pasturing the flock in Shechem? Come and I'll send you to them. And he said to him, I'll go. Then he said to him, go now and see about the welfare of your brothers and the welfare of the flock, and bring word back to me. So he sent him from the valley of the Hebron. And he came to Shechem. And a man found him, and behold, he was wandering in the field. Basically, Joseph's getting some further direction on exactly where they are. So Joseph goes and finds them at the end of verse 17. And when they saw him when they saw him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. They said to one another, here comes this dreamer. Now then come and let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we'll say, a wild beast devoured him. Then let us see what will become of his dreams. But Reuben heard this and rescued him out of their hands and said, let's not take his life. Reuben further said to them, shed no blood, throw him into this pit that's in the wilderness, but don't lay hands on him, that he might rescue him out of their hands to restore him to his father. So it came about when Joseph reached his brothers that they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the varicolored tunic that was on him, and they took him and threw him into the pit. Now the pit was empty without any water in it. Then they sat down to eat a meal, and as they raised their eyes and looked, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead with their camels bearing aromatic gum and balm and myrrh and all the things that they're trading on their way down to Egypt. You can imagine Joseph, if he's within earshot of his brothers. His brothers have suddenly taken him. They strip his clothes off of him. They throw him into this pit where there's no food or water. And they leave him down there. And he can perhaps hear them up around maybe a campfire or something, talking about what they're going to do, maybe laughing about Joseph. and figuring on what to do with him. And they decide to sell him to these traders, the Ishmaelite or Midianite traders. I had two older brothers. Sometimes they mistreated me like older brothers will. They never threw me in a pit planning to kill me and ending up deciding to, well, let's just sell them to some slave traders. My brothers never did that to me. But Joseph's brothers did that to him. And so, in verses 31 to 32, after they've sold Joseph away, they go back to their father. They've covered Joseph's coat in blood, and they bring that back, and they show it to their father, and he looks at it, and he concludes, a wild beast, which is, of course, what they want him to conclude. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. Jacob tore his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. You know, it's not the normal thing for a parent to have to bury a child. That's what, well, Jacob didn't even get to bury his child. His child, in his thought, has been eaten by wild animals. And this was the son he loved more than all the others. Imagine the pain in Jacob's heart. Well, toward the end of this chapter, we find Joseph in the very last verse of the chapter. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, Pharaoh's officer, the captain of the bodyguard. So how does Joseph respond? Joseph has a lot of good characteristics. We're going to look at his bitterness tonight. And I don't want that to cloud the fact that Joseph, in so many ways, was really just an exemplary man of how to deal with being thrown into bad situations and being mistreated. So much good about Joseph, but we are going to see this bitterness in his heart. Joseph did the best he could in that situation. And if we move over to chapter 39, verse 1, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. He made him overseer over his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. Joseph did well in that situation. Yeah, okay, the Lord was with him, but Joseph had to do well, you know, in his own decisions and his own way of handling those situations and his role under Potiphar in order for Potiphar to see this and elevate Joseph among his other servants. Joseph was a good example and a faithful example in this case. As we go further here, you know, things are looking up for Joseph, relatively speaking. I mean, if you're sold into slavery, then this is things looking up. But then all of that gain is suddenly lost when he's falsely accused. Chapter 39, verse 7. And it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he's put all that he owns in my charge. There's no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" Joseph has been thrown into a bad situation, does the best he can do in that situation, is elevated because of it, and now all of that is at risk of being lost. And it is lost because as Joseph continued to refuse her, Verse 11, it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household were there inside. And she caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." He left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. When she saw that he left his garment in her hand and fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he's brought in a Hebrew to us to make sport of us. He came in to me to lie with me, and I screamed." And so she's lying about Joseph. Verse 19, now it came about when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," that his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. You know, you hit some hard times in life, but you push through and you do your best, and things are looking great, and it's all ripped right out from underneath you. And you think the whole time, my brothers who sent me down here and threw me into this situation, instead of being at home with my family, with my father. But even in jail, Joseph did well. Verse 21, chapter 39, 21, but the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in the jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. The chief jailer did not supervise anything under Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. Joseph did well again in that situation. And then we get into chapter 40, and you have these two servants of the king, the cupbearer and the baker, or the butler and the, maybe baker, depending on your translation. Mine says the cupbearer and the baker have their dream. Pharaoh's got mad at them for whatever, thrown them into jail, and so they are there, and they have dreams. And Joseph interprets their dreams for them. For one of those men, his dream indicated that on the third day he was going to be released and freed and go back into the king's service. For the other one, his dream meant that on the third day the king was, still going to find him guilty of whatever he had accused the baker of, and he would be hung from a tree. And so it happened. And Joseph said to the cupbearer in chapter 40, verses 14 and 15, after he's given the cupbearer the interpretation, "You're going to be freed in 3 days. Go back into the king's service." Joseph says to him, verse 14, "Only keep me in mind when it goes well with you, and please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I've done nothing that they should have put me into the dungeon." So, you're a foreigner in a land where things are harsh, not always fair. You get thrown in jail, and the odds of you getting out of there are not good. But lo and behold, by the power of God, you've interpreted a dream for a man who serves the Pharaoh. Okay, here's my opportunity. And so you tell that man, "Tell Pharaoh about me. Tell how I interpreted your dream for you. Tell how I was unjustly thrown in this prison." And the cupbearer says, "Yeah, okay." But he doesn't. Joseph has to know this. Joseph knows that he's the cupbearer is released from the prison, and a couple of days go by, and you're not expecting Pharaoh to show up the next day, but a few days go by, and weeks go by, and months go by, and you realize the cupbearer didn't say a word to you, but to the Pharaoh. Or at least you figure that's the case, and that was the case. So in chapter 40, verse 23, Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. So 2 years go by. When somebody has mistreated us, when things have gone badly because of what others have done to us, it's easy to sit and feel sorry for ourselves. I'm not saying Joseph felt sorry for himself, but I know that this wore on Joseph, as we'll see a little bit later. But it's easy to do that. It's easy to just feel sorry for ourselves and bitter toward those who have put us in that situation. And I urge you to think about that in your own life. If there are relationships that you just, that you've let wear on you this way as time passes. Joseph has 2 years in this jail to think about those things. Until finally Pharaoh has a dream. The dream about the 7 lean cows and the 7 fat cows and the 7 scrawny ears of corn and the 7 full, rich ears of corn. Let me get the verse or the word that's used in the text. Well, let's go to chapter 41, verse 33. No, that's going too far. The first part of chapter 41. And the ugly and gaunt cows, verse 4, ate up the 7 sleek and fat cows. Same thing with the ears of corn, the ears of grain. The 7 scrawny ones, representing the years of famine, that consumed all the fullness of the 7 full ones, so there was nothing left of it, representing, you have these 7 years of plenty, and then the 7 years of famine that follow just consume all that was extra from that time until there's nothing left of any of it. And that's going to be the years of famine, when there's going to be nothing left for the people in Egypt. And so, Pharaoh asks all his wise men to interpret the dream, and nobody can interpret it. Finally, the cupbearer says, I should tell him about Joseph. And so he does. And they go get Joseph out of the prison, and they get some fresh clothes for him, and he shaves and freshens himself up, and comes before Pharaoh. And by the power of God, and Joseph gives credit to God. He says, this is not me, this is my God who's telling you the interpretation of the dream. Interprets the dream to indicate 7 years of famine that would follow 7 years of plenty. So we read in chapter 41, verse 33, as Joseph continues to counsel Pharaoh about this, and now let Pharaoh look for a man discerning and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. And let Pharaoh take action to appoint overseers in charge of the land, and let him exact 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 years of abundance. Then let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming, and store up the grain for food in the cities under Pharaoh's authority, and let them guard it, and let the food become a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which will occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish during the famine. Now the proposal seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this? Probably extending his hand toward Joseph. A man like this, in whom is a divine spirit? So Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. Of course, it was the Lord's wisdom. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage only in the throne. I will be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And so once again, Joseph is elevated as he continues to serve the Lord in these circumstances. Joseph gains a family in these years. Verse 46, now Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh. Remember, he was 17 when we read at the beginning of chapter 37. He's now 30 years old. And when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went out through the land of Egypt. Actually, I want to go back to verse 45. Then Pharaoh named to Joseph Zaphanath-Paneah, and he gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, as his wife. And Joseph went forth over the land of Egypt. We read about Joseph's sons down in verse 50. Now before the year of the famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, the priest of On, bore to him. And Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. Manasseh means making to forget. Verse 52, and he named the second Ephraim, for he said, God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. I'm going to go ahead and comment on this first name, on Manasseh, that means making to forget. At first glance, that looks like, Joseph's overall. He's past it. He's over it. It's not a problem for him anymore. He's been able to forget all that his brothers did to him and the resentment about that. I want to suggest to you that if you name your son making to forget, you haven't fully forgotten. That's still in your mind about, I'm getting past it now, but I remember those things and wish all of that hadn't happened to me, but at least now I've got a wife and these 2 sons, and I'm going to name my son. This is going to help me forget all the misery that I've suffered for the wrongs that were done to me. Well, then the famine comes. And in chapter 42, verses 1 through 4, the famine doesn't affect only Egypt. It affects the land of Canaan too, where Jacob and his brothers are, where Joseph's family is. Chapter 42, verse 1. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, why are you staring at one another? You can imagine a father, with his sons. There's grain down there. Why are you just sitting around looking at each other? Behold, I have heard that there's grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place, so that we may live and not die. Then the brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. Verse 6. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. And we begin to see these odd things that Joseph does, refusing to let his brothers know who he is, and playing some games with them that for a long time, first half of my life maybe, I just thought Joseph is just playing games with them. But that's not all it is. Joseph has a scheme in mind. And one wonders, perhaps, I may have commented on this in my sermon about Joseph a month ago. I'm not sure if I did or not. Why didn't his brothers recognize him? He's their brother after all. Well, remember, he's more than 30 years old now. Several years over 30, I would think, by this point, by the years of famine that followed the 7 good years. If I'm thinking right, he's got to be at least 37 by this point. And the last time they saw him, he was a 17-year-old kid. And they don't expect to see him in a position like this. And he's second in the land of Egypt, which suggests that he probably dressed like, looked like leaders of Egypt did. As we're familiar with Egyptian artwork, what did they look like? They had different hairstyles that Israelites would have worn, that had makeup and stuff on their eyes that Israelites would not have worn. A lot of reasons they wouldn't have recognized Joseph. But there's all his 10 brothers, 10 of his brothers, Benjamin wasn't there. And he recognizes them. And so, how is Joseph going to react? Is it going to be reconciliation? Is it going to be, immediately, guys, the Lord gave me a wife and sons, and I'm in this high position. I'm not bitter about all of that anymore. No, it's not that. There is a scheme to take his full brother. Remember, a lot of these are half-brothers because Jacob had 4 wives. But there's this scheme to take his full brother, Benjamin, without the rest of the family knowing anything about what's going on, without the rest of the family knowing that this is Joseph, or that Joseph is still alive even. And he's not worried about the fact that his father will then lose Benjamin also. It's just, I'm going to take Benjamin for myself. I'm going to play these games to get Benjamin down here. So chapter 42, verse 9. And Joseph mentioned the dreams. Joseph remembered the dreams which he had about them and said to them, "You're spies. You are spies. You've come to look at the undefended parts of our land." And they said to him, "No, my lord, but your servants have come to buy food. We're all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants are not spies." Joseph spoke harshly to them, the text tells us. He's cold to them. We continue reading here. Verse 12, "Yet he said to them, 'No, but you have come to look at the undefended parts of our land.' But they said, 'Your servants are 12 brothers in all, the sons of one man in the land of Canaan. Behold, the youngest is with our father today,'" Benjamin, back home with Jacob, "'and one is no more.'" Of course, they're speaking about Joseph, their brother, to whom they're speaking, though they don't realize it. Joseph said to them, it's as I said, you're spies. By this you'll be tested. By the life of Pharaoh, you shall not go from this place unless your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you that he may get your brother, while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there's truth in you. But if not by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies. So he put them all together in prison for 3 days. He reconsiders and decides to just keep one in prison and send the rest home in order to go and carry grain back to the family and to then bring Benjamin. Chapter 42, verse 18. "Now Joseph said to them on the 3rd day, 'Do this and live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers be confined in the prison. But as for the rest of you, go carry grain for the famine of your household, and bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words may be verified, and you'll not die.' Then they said to one another, 'Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us.'" They think back when they sold Joseph and say, this is that coming back on us. We continue reading. "And Reuben answered them, saying, 'Didn't I tell you, don't sin against the bull?' And you wouldn't listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood." They didn't know, however, that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them. Joseph's still standing there. They've been using a translator to talk because Joseph doesn't want them to know that he knows Hebrew. He knows their language. He wants them to think he's just an Egyptian. And he's listening to them as they're talking about this. Verse 24, "And he turned away from them and wept." There's a number of things that may have led to this emotional response from Joseph, turning aside and crying, weeping. Just the emotional distress of it. Thinking back what they've done to him. maybe recognizing some change in them. But it's not enough for him to say, okay, I'm going to let them know who I am. I'm going to stop playing these games with them. And so he lets all of them go except one, except for Simeon, who's going to hold in the prison there. He gives them grain, or he sells them grain, but then he has the money they've paid put back in the bags. And after they leave, they find the money in the bags, and they think, oh, we are in trouble now, because we're leaving Egypt with the grain and the money we paid for it. But they go on home to Jacob with the grain and with the money. So chapter 43, I don't want to go back that far. Chapter 42, verse 29. When they came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan, they told him all that had happened to them, saying, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly with us and took us for spies of the country. But we said to them, we're honest men. We're 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more. And the youngest is with our father today in the land of Canaan. And the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, by this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me, and take grain for the famine of your households, and go. But bring your youngest brother to me, that I may know that you are not spies, but honest men. And I'll give your brother to you, Simeon, that is, and you may trade in the land. That came about as they were emptying their sacks. Behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. When their father saw the bundles of money, they were dismayed. And their father Jacob said to them, you have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more, because he's being held down there in the Egyptian prison. And you would take Benjamin. All these things are against me. Reuben says to his father, you may put my 2 sons to death if I don't bring him back to you, that is, bring Benjamin back. Put him in my care, and I will return him to you. Reuben, they're desperate for food, and their brother Simeon is down there in Egypt. And Jacob doesn't want to let Benjamin go down there, because who knows what this Egyptian lord is going to do with him. And Reuben says, if I fail to bring Benjamin back, you can take my 2 sons, kill them, whatever. Jacob says in verse 38, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead. He still thinks Joseph is dead from the wild animal. And he alone is left from that wife, the 2 sons from that wife. If harm should befall him on the journey you are taking, then you will bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Do you see what Joseph is doing to his family? The stress that he's putting them through. Oh, true, we can argue. Well, his brothers deserve it. Well, yeah, they did. His father doesn't. And Joseph is causing more turmoil in the family and stress to his father with the things that he's doing, because he's bitter about the whole situation. Doesn't want to reveal himself to his brothers or his family at all. Just wants to get Benjamin down there. He's thinking about himself because he's bitter about what's happened to him. And he's just thinking about himself. Well, chapter 43, verse 15. The brothers go back down to Egypt. After a while, they don't want to go down at first because they don't want to, but then they run out of food again. They have to go back down. So, chapter 43, verse 16, they're back down there. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to his house steward, bring the men into the house, slay an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. And so, the brothers are told they're going to eat at Joseph's house. And, all this I'm sure is very strange to them. But they go, and Benjamin is there. And we read in verse 26, when Joseph came home, they brought it into the house to him, the present which was in their hand, and bowed to the ground before him. They brought presents for this Egyptian lord to try to, ingratiate themselves to him. Then he asked them about their welfare and said, "Is your old father well, of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" And they said, "Your servant our father is well. He is still alive." And they bowed down in homage. As he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, he said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me?" He said, "May God be gracious to you, my son." And Joseph hurried out, for he was deeply stirred over his brother. And he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. All the emotion in Joseph's heart after all of these years, and finally seeing Benjamin again, having to deal with his brothers whom he has no patience for. Verse 31, he washed his face and came out, and he controlled himself and said, "Serve the meal." So they served him by himself, and then by themselves. And the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with the Hebrews, for that is loathsome to the Egyptians. Now they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in astonishment. And he took portions to them from his own table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. So they feasted and drank freely with him. And then, chapter 44. He commands their sacks to be filled with food so they can carry it back home. And he says in verse 2, "And put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and his money for the grain." And he did as Joseph told him. And so, verse 4, then they had gone out of the city and were not far off, when Joseph said to his house steward, "Up, follow the men, and when you overtake them, say to them, 'Why have you repaid evil for good? Is not this the one from whom my Lord drinks? Is not this the cup that they will find in Benjamin's sack? The one from which my Lord drinks, and which he indeed uses for divination? You've done wrong in doing this.' So he overtook them and spoke these words to them. And they said to him, 'Why does my Lord speak such words as these? Far be it from your servants to do such a thing. Behold, the money which we found in the mouth of our sacks we've brought back.'" That's from the first trip. Verse 9, "With whomever of your servants it is found, the cup, let him die, and we also will be my Lord's slaves." So he said, "Now let it also be according to your words. He with whom it is found shall be my slave." It doesn't say we're going to kill whoever has the cup. It's just he's going to keep him. Joseph will keep that one as his slave, and the rest go home. Verse 11, they returned, each man lowered his sack to the ground, and each man opened his sack and searched, beginning with the oldest and ending with the youngest, and the cup was found in Benjamin's sack. Of course it was so. That's where Joseph had it placed. Then they tore their clothes, and when each man loaded his donkey, they returned to the city. When Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, he was still there, and they fell to the ground before him, and Joseph said to them, "What is this deed that you have done? Do you not know that such a man as I can indeed practice divination?" So Judah said, "What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak, and how can we justify ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Behold, we are our Lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose possession the cup has been found." But he said, "Far be it from me to do this. The man in whose possession the cup has been found, he'll be my slave. As for the rest of you, go up and feast to your father." Joseph says, "I don't want all of you. I just want the one who had the cup. The rest of you can go. I'm just going to keep the one who had the cup." Benjamin, of course. Judah knows this can't be. Then Judah approached him, verse 16, and said, "Oh, my Lord, may your servant please speak a word in my Lord's ears, and don't be angry with your servant, for you're equal to Pharaoh. My Lord asked his servants, saying, 'Have you a father or brother?' And we said to my Lord, 'We have an old father, and a little child of his old age. Now his brother is dead.'" They suppose Joseph is dead by this point. So he alone, Benjamin alone, is left of his mother, and his father loves him. Then you said to your servants, bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him. But we said to my Lord, the lad cannot leave his father, for if he should leave his father would die. You said to your servants, however, unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall not see my face again. Thus it came about when we went up to your servant, my father. We told him the words of my Lord, and our father said, go back, buy us a little food. But we said, we can't go down. If our younger brother is with us, then we will go down. For we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. And your servant my father said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons, and the one went out from me, Joseph. And I said, surely he's torn to pieces, and I have not seen him since. And if you take this one also from me, and harm befalls him, you'll bring my gray hair down to Sheol in sorrow. Now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad's not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will come about that when he sees that the lad is not with us, that he'll die. Thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant, our father, down to Sheol in sorrow. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I don't bring him back to you, then let him bear the blame. Let me bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please let your servant remain. Judah says, I'll stay. Therefore, let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord. And let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest I see the evil that would overtake my father? Joseph has had this scheme. He's been working this scheme for them to prove that they have this youngest brother. He gets them down there. Then he has the part of the scheme where he frames his youngest brother Benjamin of stealing the silver cup so that he can bring them back and say, well, I'm keeping him because, he stole my cup. I'm going to keep him as a slave. The rest of you go home. But Judah says, no, our father will just die. It's going to kill our father. And that's the breaking point for Joseph. Up until this point, Joseph has not been thinking about how this will affect the family, how it will affect his own father. He's not been thinking about any of that. He's just been bitter about how his life has gone. And he's saying, I'm just going to get my little brother and forget about the rest of my family. Until his oldest brother, Judah, pleads with him and offers himself in place of Benjamin. And Joseph sees the selflessness of Judah, and he finally sees how this will destroy their father. So that in chapter 45, verse 1, then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried, have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him, and Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it. The household of Pharaoh heard it. When somebody finally lets go of their bitterness and is willing to love and forgive again, it's a lot of emotion. And I think that's what we see in Joseph at this point. He wept so loudly the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And then Joseph said to his brothers, I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. I'm sure they were. Then Joseph said to his brothers, please come closer to me. And they came closer, and he said, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now don't be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God has sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. Well, it was both. But Joseph is willing to put it in terms of just, this is what God saw needed to happen. And so he suddenly has this about-face. And gone is the plan to rob his father of his youngest son Benjamin, and to send his sons back home and be rid of them.